Nearly 25 years after the book, The Tipping Point, a New York Times bestseller, became widely acclaimed, Canadian author and journalist Malcolm Gladwell is back with another novel. He joins us now in studio with the release of Revenge of the Tipping Point, Overstories, Super Spreaders, and the Rise of Social Engineering. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
So in The Tipping Point 2.0, as it's referred to, you revisit your first book from 25 years ago. And you say it's like looking at a picture of yourself when you're younger and not recognizing yourself. Yeah. Can you describe what that's like to revisit Malcolm from 25 years ago?
Well, it's so much, I was writing about epidemics and contagious behavior. And in the 25 years that passed between my first book, A Tipping Point, and this book, we've had the rise of the internet and social media. We've had COVID, a pandemic that shuts down the world. We've had the opioid crisis, the biggest public health catastrophe in 100 years. So I feel like so much has happened in the general, field of contagious behavior that there was a lot more to be said.
A lot has happened, as you say, but a lot has happened in your life, too. You're not the same Malcolm you were 25 years ago. Yeah. You now have 2 daughters, I believe.
I do.
Biggie Smalls, your
My
cat. We have
yes.
to mention that you love. As you make your way through Revenge of the Tipping Point, it's not every day that you really see a novelist quoting themselves from 2 decades ago. So I'm wondering what this process was like for yourself to confront yourself in a way with your latest project.
There were things I wrote 25 years ago that I disagree with now. There were other things that in my first book, I have a whole chapter on Sesame Street and Blue's Clues.
Right.
I was like, what? I didn't even have kids back then. Well, that was, but a lot of it was, there was just some, a lot of it was just that I wrote that book when I was in my 30s, and in a time in the late 90s, early 2000s, when the world was a very kind of optimistic place. The Berlin Wall had just fallen, and crime was going down everywhere, and social problems were on the wane. When no one talked about climate change. So it's just we live in it's funny how much things have been transformed over the last quarter century. And so this new book it's a little bit more, it examines a little bit of the dark side in a way that I wasn't interested in with my first book. And
you really highlight a number of, I guess, stories that have happened throughout our history. The most popular and famous bank robberies, how that tended to spread, where it didn't spread, and why. If you don't mind, I want to just read a part of your book that really captivated me. You said, "If the world can be moved by just the slightest push, then the person who knows where and when to push has real power. So who are those people? What are their intentions? What techniques are they using?" Yeah. When you're writing that and, folks are making their way through your book here, how would you like the reader to receive the stories that you're telling and the topics that you're exploring? Yeah. Well, I'm trying to alert us to the ways in which the principles of epidemics and contagious behavior are sometimes used against us. So the story that frames the book is the story of the opioid crisis and how it was one pharmaceutical company making one product set in motion a disaster that now claims in North America well over 100,000 lives a year. And they did that by very much using epidemic principles, by understanding there was a very small group of doctors who, if they could influence those doctors, would be sufficient to set in motion this enormous explosion in the use of OxyContin. They were thinking along these lines. And if we want to understand how to prevent a similar kind of crisis from emerging down the line, we need to understand what our vulnerabilities are as a society and how people like a pharmaceutical company can exploit those vulnerabilities. And so you say it's time that we take tipping points seriously. Yeah. You've had to grapple with this yourself. How do you explain and understand what a tipping point is and this rallying call? How do we ourselves begin to not only observe it, but take the tipping point seriously? Yeah. Well, if you remember back to a classic tipping point was March of 2020, when COVID goes from being some weird thing we heard about that was happening in Wuhan, China, to something that all of us were terrified of, and we were all staying home. It literally was, there was a week, remember, where we
We went from not being concerned about it to being so terrified of it that we were staying home. That's a tipping point. And I think we need to understand that those kinds of sudden dramatic changes happen all the time. So I have a chapter in the book about how it was that we suddenly changed our mind in North America about gay marriage. It was an issue that divided us, that gay marriage activists thought it would be a 50-year battle, and then all of a sudden it just went away as an issue. And we decided, oh, that's not something we're terrified of anymore. That was the positive version of this. And that happened, no one predicted that change. And that change happened way, way, way quicker than anyone would imagine it ever happen. And understanding those kinds of sudden shifts is the goal of Revenge of the Tipping Point.
And it's so easy to kind of understand where you're coming from and also apply it to a lot of the real life events that we see coming. An election in the U.S.
Are you trying to get me to talk about the election?
Here, I'm not going to ask you for your take here. I want to ask you though, when we are confronting these tipping points, how can we do that on a personal level as well, as individuals?
Yeah, I think one of the big lessons of this book is how much individuals matter. That epidemics are not moved by the broad majority of people. They're moved by a very, very small number of people who are behaving in some exceptional way. And knowing who those people are and what they're doing and the strategies they're using is essential.
And they know which buttons to push.
Which buttons to push,
Okay,
yeah.
Malcolm Gladwell, you always have us thinking deeper. Thank you so much for coming in. This is Revenge of the Tipping Point. You can go ahead and pick it up and give it a good read. Thank you so much.
Thank you.